Welcome to the Community Development Podcast, a podcast dedicated to community development practice and approaches, sharing our learning and connecting the workforce. My name is Russell. Hello and welcome to episode 26 of the Community Development Podcast. Little diversion from the usual format. Rather than record something brand new with a contributor, I have gone back into my sort of personal archive, if you like, and dusted off an episode I recorded way back in 2017 as part of a support programme that I was managing at the time for the Community's First programme in Wales. And part of that broader service was developing some podcast media that just helped scratch beneath the surface of the community involvement activities that the workers in that programme were developing in order to involve communities, to involve people from different communities of interest, different communities of place in their work in Communities First, a programme that ran in Wales from between 2002 to 2018, almost unparalleled in British social policy history, a programme of that nature running for so long. There's a wealth of information out there about Communities First, about what it was, what it wasn't, and its successes and perceived failures. And this isn't specifically about that programme, but what it does, I think, is really nicely just scratch beneath the surface of some of the community involvement activities of two workers, one of whom, Peter Beynon, based in Swansea, and another one, Allan, Herbert, based in Cardiff, both of whom were working in very, very ethnically diverse communities of those respective cities, and involving obviously the breadth of language and faith and so on that are part of those communities. Peter and Allan speak in the second half of the podcast, the first half of which is with Duncan from the People and Work Unit, a charity based in Wales. And Duncan was one of the three authors, with Anna, Nicola and Chris Johns, of a paper into the experiences of different ethnic groups in Wales with respect to poverty. That was published in 2016 by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Is still available on their website in both English and Welsh. What I thought was a useful thing to do, given that we were talking about ethnically diverse communities, was to give some sort of insight into ethnicity in Wales via one of the authors of that paper. So Duncan joins us. It goes straight into the chat I had with Duncan and then on to Peter and Allan. Makes lots of reference to Communities First, a programme, as I said, that came to an end in 2018. And in that respect, it's a little bit out of date. However, the experiences of working in ethnically diverse communities haven't changed. Programmes come and go. The challenges and the issues and the vibrancy and the energy of working in such ethnically diverse communities is much the same as it's ever been. So I hope you find it useful and look forward to getting another new episode out to you soon. Thank you for joining us. It's going to be a bit clearer as to what the context is in relation to community involvement and the involvement of BAME communities and individuals in Communities First in due course, based on some of the work you've done. But if people aren't familiar with you, aren't familiar with the People and Work Unit, what is it that they should know?
People and Work is a voluntary sector organisation. We work through a mix of commissioned research and evaluation. So, for example, a study commissioned by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. We also do a lot of work for the Welsh Government. Then we also have our own programme of action research. And for me, the focus of the research, a lot of our work is around looking at inequalities linked to poverty, ethnicity and disability, and often two or three of those can interlink. So looking at helping people, in this case, looking at the links between poverty and ethnicity and what can be done to tackle those. So there's been two studies. The first was a study commissioned by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation in 2014, I think, which was looking at poverty and ethnicity in Wales, which was part of a wider UK-wide programme that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation had commissioned, looking at various issues linked to poverty and ethnicity. And as part of that, there were a series of country studies, and Wales was one of those countries. And then a series of other studies looking at issues like employer behaviour and workplace culture, places in local labour markets, the role of social network, how people balance caring and earning responsibilities, and the impact of the recession, which were UK-wide studies. Although they were UK-wide studies, a lot of the research was conducted in England for those studies. And in order to pull together the findings from those studies and think about the implications for Wales Specifically, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation commissioned a further study to produce a viewpoint to look at the implications of those studies for breaking the links between poverty and ethnicity in Wales, which Anna Nicole, Chris Johns and myself worked on.
And when we talk about ethnicity in Wales, clearly Cardiff, Newport, Swansea as well, certainly Cardiff, Newport with the docks, traditional docks population, Swansea to maybe slightly lesser extent, have those communities where there are high concentrations and more diversity in terms of ethnicities. I suppose Wrexham probably more recently it gets considered in the same sort of breath as well. Having said that, Wales is still quite ethnically, or not undiverse, but there's less diversity in Wales than some of the other home nations. But at a very local level, I think I'd be right in saying that you will find high degrees of diversity.
Absolutely.
At a very local level. And when we say local, we're talking wards, certainly LSOAs then.
Yes. Yeah, so for example, there'll be some wards where up to 60% of the population will be from ethnic minority groups. I think more broadly, even where the numbers are relatively small, there are parts of Wales where the ethnic population is changing, where, for example, you've had people who've come from some of the EU accession countries, like, for example, Poland or Czech Republic, which is changing the ethnic composition of areas from Wales which traditionally have been much less diverse.
Well, I think Wrexham would be, or some communities within Wrexham would bear that out. Okay, Communities First has responsibility to involve people in the direction and the focus and the design of the Communities First programme locally in terms of the activities that are designed and delivered to address aspects of poverty, to support people in all those sorts of ways. And we'll be hearing from Communities First staff in clusters in Swansea and Cardiff about some of the techniques and the very practical work that they do in terms of community involvement. It's important, though, to set a context, I think, in terms of what they're doing on the ground at a very local level, in terms of what this research found. Hence we've got you in to talk about it. But one of the caveats that you've sort of said, and were very helpful to sort of reminding me on, is that it's defining people by ethnicity is of some relevance and some use, but to only define people by their ethnicity, as I probably would bristle at if that happened to me, is not the full story. And there's things to do with gender, there's things to do with the countries from which they've migrated, their migration journey and so on. So can you just explain a little bit more detail about as you've got a very special term for it as well. So I want to bring that in as well. So can you just maybe expand on that a little bit more for me?
Sure. So one of the key aspects, or I suppose a foundation for the research is, as we were saying, that people aren't purely defined in terms of their ethnicity, that it's often other characteristics about them, like, for example, their gender, or, for example, their migration history and the ways in which they've travelled to Wales. So, for example, the experiences of someone who's come as a recently arrived asylum seeker will be very different to, for example, someone who is from an ethnic minority but whose family has lived in Wales for generations. And you can see that in terms of areas like, for example, their English language skills, their access to benefits, the types of social networks. So, for example, how many people they would know in their community, the extent to which they would understand how, for example, the benefits system worked, their understanding of, for example, their entitlements to healthcare and so on, are likely to be very different, not because of their ethnicity, but because the routes through which they come to Wales are very different. And similarly, for example, the experiences of men and women from different ethnic groups can be very different. The experience of disabled people within ethnic groups can be very different from people who are not disabled. The experience of young and old. There's a whole range of ways in which experience is defined, not simply by people's ethnicity.
So, bearing that in mind then, for your let's say, so the average Communities First worker, increasingly more as the way the programme has gone, it's focused on the individual,
sure,
their circumstances, being much more people-centred about helping people back into work. What are the educational and employment circumstances to that individual, their history, their level of education, qualifications and so on. There would appear to be merit then, if I've understood you correctly, in when dealing with somebody from an ethnic minority, is finding out a little bit more about their background in that respect. What is the family relationship? How long have they lived in the country? How long has the family lived in the country? Have they married into a migrant family or an ethnic minority but settled, as it were, family? So, okay, that's probably very, very helpful. Did you get your special term in then?
No.
Go on, get your special term in, because I've raised expectations.
Yes, and the term is intersectionality, which describes the way in which lots of different facets or parts of a person's identity shapes their experiences.
I think that's very helpful, because when we were doing some of the initial research with focus groups into the LIFT programme, when that was still at a sort of a pilot stage, so that was the Tackling Workless Households programme. I think it was still called the Tackling Workless Households programme at that stage. It was clear that people had to investigate, if you like, the household status of an individual that they were working with in order to gauge whether they were eligible for that programme or not. So on a very, very sort of technical level. And some clusters previously hadn't inquired along those lines. They were very centred on that individual, which is great, but not taking into consideration that sort of concentric circles, that immediate sort of family household sort of network.
Sure.
So I think there's a sort of like a parallel there in terms of finding out, okay, what are the other factors, what are the other relationships and circumstances that define who an individual is, I suppose, without getting sort of too philosophical about it.
No, and I think that's a fundamental importance of really focusing upon individuals, and we would strongly argue that applies to people of all ethnicities. It's not purely an issue for ethnic minorities. If, for example, you're working, say, people in Porth or Rwanda, you'd want to know more about their individual circumstances in order to know what their needs are, what their aspirations are, what types of support what assets they've got at the moment, what challenges they face and so on, in order to be able to help them appropriately and effectively. So it's certainly not something that's unique to ethnic minorities. I suppose the other point I'd want to make is, stressing the importance of thinking about individuals. That doesn't mean we can't make some broad generalisations about people from ethnic minorities. So, for example, in general, people from ethnic minorities are more disadvantaged than the white majority population. But even then, you need to then think about different ethnic groups within that. So that, for example, levels of poverty amongst the Chinese ethnic minority group are generally much lower than those from Pakistani and Bangladeshi groups. So I think at that level it's useful to be aware of, for example, the likelihood that, say, someone with Bangladeshi and Pakistani heritage of being in poverty, the likelihood is that they will be in poverty and in deeper poverty than members of other ethnic minority groups. But obviously if you were working with them, you'd want to get to know that family and find out more about what they're doing. It's quite possible they might, for example, have a very high paying job in the NHS, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course there's poverty within the white,
absolutely,
Welsh, British-born population as well, which won't be any surprise to anyone in the Community's First programme listening to this, obviously. So what are some of the sort of the headline findings then from the research?
Sure. I suppose some of the key headline findings are, the first point, and we've obviously touched upon this in the sense that people of all ethnicities experience poverty, that whilst poverty levels are generally higher from people of ethnic minority groups, they're also high for the white majority population within Wales. But as we've touched upon then, if you're looking across ethnic minority groups, there's a considerable range of levels of poverty for those different ethnic minority groups. But it does depend upon what particular measure of poverty you're looking at. If you're looking at something like education and attainment, it's actually ethnic minority groups have made a great deal of progress in the last 5 to 10 years. And many ethnic minority groups are now outperforming white British, white Welsh pupils at 16. So you do have to be careful in terms of generalising about this. But I think another key thing is that there's no necessary link between people's ethnicity and poverty levels. That while at the moment within Wales we observe generally higher levels of poverty amongst people from ethnic minorities, there's no necessary relation there. And if you say you're looking at a UK level, you can see changes in the levels of poverty of different ethnic minority groups over time. So poverty can go up and down for different ethnic minority groups, but of course also across different places as well. I think it illustrates, those differences illustrate the point there's nothing necessary or automatic about this, that we can break the link between poverty and ethnicity. And that was one of the key reasons why the JO have commissioned this programme, in terms of giving us a better understanding of what the links are between poverty and ethnicity, and also what can be done in terms of action around that.
That's interesting, Duncan. I mean, in terms of where the programme is at the moment, Communities First, in this financial year we have an increased focus on employability. There's been an emphasis and a focus on it for a while. Who knows where we're going with the programme after this financial year. But there were some interesting and significant findings in relation to income and employment in the research as well.
I think focus first on employment, because employment levels have a key bearing on income levels. And I think the headline findings are that generally levels of employment among ethnic minority groups are lower than the white majority population. So there is a challenge in terms of unemployment, and that's one of the reasons why levels of poverty are higher for many people from ethnic minority groups. But there's also a secondary factor that where people from some ethnic minority groups are in work, they tend to be in more poorly paid work than the white majority. Now, that's not across the board. There are some groups, like, for example, the Chinese population, that break that relationship, that tend to be in higher paid work than the white majority population. But for some groups, like, for example, those of Bangladeshi and Pakistani heritage, there are significant challenges around what you might call poor work. And in supporting those people to progress within that or move to other occupations is a key challenge, and ways in which we could reduce their levels of poverty. Another key part of this is around racism and discrimination, that there is evidence of discrimination in relation to recruitment. Now, it's difficult to evidence. There's certainly a strong perception amongst ethnic minority groups that racism is a key barrier to recruitment for them finding work and so on, and where studies have been done using dummy or fake applications, one has a name that's clearly from the white majority and another has an ethnic minority name, those applications from the white majority are more likely to be accepted. So there is some evidence of discrimination there, and certainly clear perception. But if you're actually looking at what people earn when they're in work, there's very little evidence of a wage gap at that level. So people from different ethnic minority groups doing similar work get paid similar amounts, and this is one of the areas where Wales differs from the rest of the UK. So the key issue is what people do and the choices that people make in terms of which areas of work they're in. That's much more important than issues around discrimination around, for example, around wages. So the key challenges for all groups are around unemployment, which is higher for some groups, and this issue around poor work. And that they disproportionately affect some groups. So, for example, levels of unemployment amongst white, gypsy, Irish traveller groups in Merthyr are amongst some of the highest in the whole of the UK. And there are particular issues around concentration in poor work for Caribbean and Bangladeshi groups.
Right. And presumably some of those jobs, some of those sectors, there'll also be a place dimension to those. There'll be clusters of those sorts of jobs as well, maybe in some of the manufacturing areas, heads of the valleys areas perhaps as well. So there's always a place dimension. And it's important to remember that communities first,
absolutely,
primarily, almost exclusively perhaps, but certainly at a programme level, is a place-based sort of programme.
Sure.
Okay.
And I think place is another of the key dimensions that affects people's experiences. That place, as you're saying, affects the type of local labour market opportunities there are, but it also has a big impact on, for example, the quality of public services that you can access. If you're living in an area with good schools, that's great, but many ethnic minorities are concentrated in areas that are more socioeconomically disadvantaged, many of which will be community first areas, and on average, schools in those areas face more challenges and often struggle to provide the same quality of education that a school in a more affluent area might face. So that's another way in which place can affect that. And finally, place can have a big issue on how people feel, their day-to-day experiences, the kind of sense of inclusion, the sense of feeling part of a community can vary massively. And certainly when we did the research several years ago, people talked very positively about some places that were on the face of it were economically poor, but were seen as very vibrant communities. Communities first was certainly a key part of that, but it wasn't obviously not the only factor. But in terms of shaping people's sense of place, that sense of belonging, and people often, while they really liked the areas they were living in, were often very reluctant to leave those areas because of what they perceived as, for example, much higher levels of racism outside those areas. And certainly for some ethnic minority groups, there is a challenge in that they are not very mobile, that they tend to stay in particular places, often because of the sense of security, the social networks and so on that are grown up in those areas. But again, it's difficult to generalise. There'll be other ethnic minority groups, for example, those who've travelled from EU accession countries in search of work, are often much more mobile, much more willing to travel throughout Wales in search of work, and therefore tend to experience lower levels of unemployment, because they're much more willing to move and travel in search of work, but may find it much harder to develop the kind of social networks to fit in and belong to communities because they're moving so much.
Okay. We're finding before we start talking about some of the practical work that Communities First is doing in Swansea, Cardiff and Newport, some of the implications then for people who are working in this realm, not exclusively for Communities First. There's a very helpful summary document of the paper that was published in February. We can make this available to accompany this podcast on the Learning Zone, is that, and certainly under the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, there's a big opportunity now to break some of these links between poverty and ethnicity, to be more engaging, to be more involving then, to use the term that we use in the programme. And some of the recommendations that you make in terms of the implications for action on poverty and inequality and ethnicity centres on things like engagement, to test ways of communicating and providing reliable information. There's some recommendations here around identifying, and that's often can be a challenge for some of the more hidden groups, but to be more proactive in engaging with disengaged groups. So, for example, as part of family and community engagement, schools could perhaps engage with parents from ethnic minority groups, and there's a parallel there probably with some of the Communities First workers. In terms of some of those other implications, is there anything else that you'd want to highlight here?
I guess one of the key things is that there's no single solution here. There's no silver bullet. There's no single thing that would break the link between poverty and ethnicity. But equally, I think there are lots of opportunities. Some things are quite simple. Some things are much more complex. So on the complex end, it would be looking at, for example, how you can shape labour markets. But at the other end, I think a lot of the work around how you can support, enable and encourage people to make better use of public services, I think there's lots of scope for lots of opportunities there to taking action. And I think ideas around person-centred planning are critical there, because it's thinking about the needs, or really focusing on the needs of an individual and the ways in which we can ensure that public services meet people's needs is a key part of it. It's also how we break down the potential barriers that mean that people are not accessing or not taking up public services. Now, that may be relating to ignorance, that people just don't know what they're entitled to, they don't know what the services are or how to access them. But it may also be linked to issues around trust and potentially fears around racism or discrimination. And I think this brings in the point you're raising about being much more proactive and really trying to build bridges and between services and communities to ensure that people not only know what they're entitled to, but are supported and encouraged and want to use those services.
So there's clear parallels there. You're talking about public services, but there's clear parallels with Communities First in terms of then how they design job clubs and work clubs, how they design some of the advice type services around sort of financial advice, debt management and things like that, isn't there?
The only other thing I might want to add is around, we talked about the importance of person-centred services. The other side to it is that many of the needs of people from ethnic minorities are the same as those of the white majority population. They need access to good schools, they need access to healthcare, they need access to good quality information, advice and guidance, they need help with debt, they need help with housing and so on. So their needs aren't unique. The challenge is finding ways to ensure that the services that we've got, which may be state services, it may be the work of Communities First, are meeting the needs of those groups, and also that the engagement is there to ensure that any potential barriers to using those services are broken down and that you're actively reaching out and engaging people.
If anybody wanted to know more a little bit about this work, presumably welcome to get in touch with you at the People and Work Unit, and we can make some of the contact details available with the podcast.
Within Wales, while there is a public commitment to tackling poverty and also tackling the links between poverty and ethnicity, we're not making fast enough, deep enough progress in terms of breaking those links. So there's a real need for new and innovative actions in order to break that link.
Which is a perfect link to the next conversation in terms of actions. So Duncan, once again, thank you very much, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
You're listening to the Community Development Podcast. My name is Russell Todd. You can follow the podcast and myself on Twitter at CommDevT Podcast, COMMDEVT Podcast, and at Llanerch, LLANNERCH. That's been a helpful overview of the JRF work and the viewpoint work that followed it. So let's now involve Peter and Allan from Swansea and from Cardiff. Hello, gents.
Hello.
Thank you for coming along. The work has outlined, that Jeff has done, has outlined the importance of being aware of particular ethnicities, particular groups, some of the characteristics of those groups. Things really interesting how it's important to not just look at a homogenous group, but to look at, for example, the migration path that people have undertaken to come to Wales or to Cardiff or to Swansea. So what I'd like to do now with you both is just kind of get a better flavour of how you involve people from the BAME communities, migrant workers as well, perhaps refugees, or those groups as well, but in a very practical way within your community involvement work. So but before you do that, it's probably helpful just to explain a little bit about who you are, your area, and give a flavour as well of the geography and the demography if people don't know the communities you're in. Allan?
My name is Allan Herbert. I work for South Riverside Community Development Centre. We're one of the 4 third sector organisations that lead on the delivery element of Communities First within Cardiff. The particular cluster that we've got, it covers 18,000 plus people, and it covers the 3 wards of Beynon, Grangetown and Riverside. It's not all of those wards. The wards themselves reflect a real intensity of people from other communities and other cultures, and they have done for many years. People would know the Tiger Bay area of Cardiff of old, and that's the area where the first multicultural communities of Cardiff were created, and that they came with the coal industry in the late part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, and has developed through the years. That was added to by the amount of people that came from other, particularly Indian subcontinent areas into the country in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, and that's since been built on by a huge plethora of other communities that have come into the city. So we tend to work with as many of the communities as we can. We'll take this as much as we can, a similar approach to working with those communities, and it's one that's very much driven by our community development principles, which we've incorporated into the way that we enact our community involvement processes. And our basic take on that is you have as many different ways in which you relate to communities as is needed. We've been part of a whole process within the city that's broken down the gatekeeper type mentality that did exist for a number of years for all the best reasons. In a lot of cases it's not as sinister as it sounds. People were protective of their communities, but we've got to the stage now where we will work with the people who are respected within those communities. We'll work with the people who are respected within the particular religious parts of those communities, but we'll work with numerous other levels as well. We'll work with adult men, we'll work with adult women, we'll work with young men, we'll work with children, we'll work with particular little subgroups within communities. And you can't assume that any of the communities, everybody from India is the same. They're not, in the same way that everybody from the UK is not the same. So it takes a long time to realise the nuances within those communities, and the way you do it is through keeping communication channels alive and analysing the information that you got, checking back with people and making sure that you're continually refining the ways you work with communities.
And presumably the different cultural and sort of linguistic aspects of all those different communities probably is a challenge then, perhaps a good challenge, but
it's absolutely huge. A lot of people that come as particularly people, the majority of people that came all the way up until the mid-70s at least were people that came as economic migrants, and often the very nature of that economic migration meant that they were coming from areas of their country where they couldn't make enough of a living. And often those areas were more remote areas, they were country areas. Good example is some of the Pakistani communities of Riverside. They come from the real northwest tip of Pakistan. It's a really remote area of Pakistan. Example around language, they speak a dialectic language that's only spoken by 2% of the people in Pakistan, and is spoken by nearly 50% of the Pakistani people in Riverside.
Really?
So that's an indication of the type of things you need to understand around language. And
that's the sort of point that illustrates what Duncan's talking about in terms of there's not a homogeneous or homogeneity, is that the word?
Yeah.
Within certain ethnic groups as well.
Can I just
Peter,
make a
yes.
point, just following on from that, with the we work largely with the Bangladeshi community in Swansea, and the majority of them speak a language called Sylheti, and there's actually no written form of Sylheti, so that is a massive issue for us when we try to engage with them. If we are, for example, translating something into Arabic, that's fine, but we can't actually translate anything into Sylheti because it doesn't exist in its written form.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Sounds a bit like my Welsh. There's not a written form for my Welsh. Anyway, to give a flavour though of your cluster in Swansea, Peter.
Yeah.
Whereabouts in the city are you?
Hi, my name is Peter Beynon. I'm a community engagement officer for the South Cluster in Swansea. The South Cluster has a population of about 12,000 people. It covers probably about 4 or 5 very distinct communities. We have the Sandfields area of the city, which is right on the seafront, surrounding the old vetch field and behind Swansea Prison. And then we travel up through the city centre, Davati area of Swansea, and then into the old industrial heart of the city, I suppose, the Havard and Landor, and then further on up then towards the motorway, towards the community of Plasmal. With the BAME communities that we largely work with are the Bangladeshi community, and they are based in both the Sandfields area of the city and the Havard. Even though both Bangladeshi communities very different with regards to the percentage that work, percentage that don't work, the type of work they do. So they are very different. Apart from that, we have a large percentage of people from Nigeria and West Africa now. And in the last 18 months, 2 years, we have seen a dramatic increase in people from the Middle East. And that's largely due to Swansea having a city of sanctuary status. So that has presented new challenges for us with regard to language, but we do have the benefit that a lot of those countries do all speak Arabic, so we can communicate that way.
Right. That's very helpful. Got a bit nostalgic when you mentioned the vetch there. I mean, in terms of your community involvement plans, there's clearly quite a lot of diversity within those communities. There's a lot of need. There's need for the white Welsh-born populations within those clusters as well, of course. And this is not solely about BME communities, but in terms of trying to involve people from those communities, what are some of the sort of techniques, or what are some of the practical things that you've had to do to make some of the services or the offer that Communities First has available for them relevant, accessible, and meeting their needs?
From our point of view, it's the way we operate as a community organisation, which we obviously embrace within the Communities First programme, and it's also very much to do with the fact that we manage a lot of community facilities. We've got the South Riverside Community Development Centre owns one building. It's the rear end of a church building. It's got a community hall. We've got 2 other buildings in the area that we also control. We've got on long-term lease from the local authority called the Riverside Warehouse and the Wyndham Street Centre. We've got offices and a training room in Beynon Community Centre, and we co-manage a facility in the middle of Grangetown called the Buzz, and more recently we also co-manage a community room that's attached to a new hub in Cardiff, which is the response within Cardiff to reshaping library services and bringing in a broader range of council services into that. And the consultation process that led up to that in Grangetown noted that we needed to have a community space, and we've taken on the co-running of that space, particularly how that space is used out of library hours. So the community space is used in evenings and weekends, and we caretake that space and we share the booking responsibility. So a huge part of how we relate to communities is about a much broader offer. It's not just about how we might relate particular services or particular projects. It's about how we relate to people in their everyday lives. So the fact that we've got spaces that people might use for a birthday party, they might use for a religious celebration. Another thing we often do, and we're very, very open to, is giving people spaces where they can just meet, because often you get people that want to meet around issues and concerns, and they might, out of those issues and concerns, form some kind of campaigning group or some sort of action group, and they can only meet in their kitchen so many times before it starts to get on everybody's nerves.
I can remember being part, it was one of the early inquiries I took on the support service, or the advice service as we were calling it back then. Around 2009-10, there were several community groups based around ethnicity, nationality in Newport. And you had the Russian-speaking Women's Association, there was a Darfur organisation, there was a Somali group. It was very, very diverse, African, European, Asian, and they'd come together to basically agree some form of tenancy and terms of use of a community space in the Pill part of Newport. Yeah. And of course, very, very diverse. And it was fascinating seeing some of the cultural and some of the gender and some of the faith kind of factors, if you like, at play, close up, and you know, massive eye opener for me, because traditionally in sort of community development terms I'd worked in largely, you know, white valleys communities, in the Gwent Valleys, in Merthyr as well. So it was great seeing that up close and seeing that dynamic. But the space, I think, you know, the point I'm trying to make is the space is critical.
It's crucial, you know, because
and rather than having all of them having their own little space. You know,
but particularly in inner city environments now, space is a premium anywhere, and space is expensive. And where 20 years ago you could probably negotiate with a church that you get the church hall for free, they're up against it. So even church halls now cost you 20-25 quid an hour. So it's responding to the relative levels of poverty within those communities and allowing them access in. We as a community organisation, and we've incorporated this once again into some of our community's first work, you know, that there are certain groups who we've never charged and we never will. There's a small little Urdu school that meets in our centre and has for 20 years. We've never charged them a penny. We've got no intention of charging them anything. And what we get out of that is they are now a time credit partner. They become a route into certain parts of the community that you wouldn't necessarily reach. We can promote homework clubs through them. There's all manner of different things that roll out of a certain level of openness and availability, and making sure that access is a prime element in what you do.
Yeah, just to follow on from that about space, if we would focus on the Sandfields area, there is no space. You know, that sounds crazy because you're in the city centre, but there is a community centre, but that is booked every day. And I think just following on from that point, which is a cracking project in Swansea, and where we've probably been able to engage with our BME community the greatest is on the old vetch field. When they knocked that site down, there is now the vetch community garden, and that's been there for 5 years now. People can only, they don't class it as an allotment, they class it as a community garden. You have to live in the Sandfields to have an area, and it's one place you can go in the city and see people of all different backgrounds mix, and that's where we have had our greatest success, is going down there on an informal level and just striking up conversations. Because the difficulty we've got is, yes, we have churches, and yes, there's a big mosque in Swansea, but if you want to put on a course in a church, that could be a barrier in itself for other people from religious backgrounds who don't necessarily feel comfortable going in there. So I think that's the point. You've got to meet in a place that feels comfortable for all and is accessible for all as well.
Totally agree. I mean, we're adamantly both religiously and culturally neutral in everything we do. We encourage as many opportunities as possible for people to come together, but you recognise there's times when they need to meet in a particular way with a particular group. And another aspect of where we are, on top of the cultural diversity, and I could talk for the next quarter of an hour on the different cultures that are in the area. That it's absolutely immense, the different types of cultures that are there and the different types of places people have come from. But it's also the intensity of religious observance. We've got a really massively high level of religious observance in the area. We've got 3 mosques, a Hindi temple, a Sikh temple. We've got very flourishing churches that are, again, the African communities have bolstered on top of an already quite rich attendance from Caribbean communities. And we've even got the best attended Catholic church service in the city on a Sunday, and that's Eastern European people coming in, and they've got a priest who speaks Eastern European languages, and that's packed out. So there's an incredible intensity of religious observance. It brings challenges because where different religions rub up against each other. At times you need to manage and mediate. At times we've had various instances where you need to make sure that people are living in that sort of harmonious way with each other. But it also brings loads of opportunities as well. And major to those are just about every religious leaning will bring with it a certain aspect about giving back and about being generous with your time. And so we build a lot on that. We don't go counter to that. We work with it. And it's a huge benefit within, and to us it gets incorporated within the community involvement aspect of what we do.
Right.
Because it's as well as what we might do in promoting volunteering, you've got hundreds of people that are volunteering every day of the week anyway, and they're doing it off the back of their religious observance.
Yeah. I think a lot of us would recognise, we've worked a lot in the programme, community development context, recognise that faith for some people is a very motivating force. I can remember the number of times working with like small sort of congregational chapels in the valleys, Baptist churches, your traditional sort of non-conformist sort of fabric. But then also your church in Wales, your Anglican Catholic as well.
One of the difficulties we've had with time banking, because all the Communities First areas in Cardiff now, along with some other services from the council, use the time banking time credit system, and we have had difficulties with that because the notion of reward, which a time credit is somewhat of an anathema to people who are volunteering and giving time on the back of their faith, because the type of response you get is, I don't want a reward. I'm doing this because I want to. It's within my faith. So I don't want a free cinema ticket for doing this. What we tried to do with that, and it's worked a treat with some people, we're in the process of trying to embed it a bit further, is to say that you can use time credits as a way of increasing your religious observance by pooling them, giving them to a play group, and then they can go to the cinema. So it's an indication of the type of negotiations you have to go into with groups that are have a particular view around why they're doing things, and you're coming in with something that might be a bit alien to them, so you can't just keep battering them with it. You've got to negotiate your way into
sounds very entrepreneurial on your part. Do you find, in terms of talking about faith, religious observance, things like that, one can be flippant and sort of say, the calendar must have, tons written on it for different festivals and different sort of periods that are important to different faiths. First question, do you find you've had to get to know more about some of those?
Definitely. And I can even give you an example now of something that's like, for example, this was last week. We know that the Bangladeshi community, specifically the ladies, love to do physical activity. They don't have a great opportunity to do it. A lot of them are very... large percentage of them don't work, they look after the children, so they love to do physical activity. At the end of the month now, there is a Get Fit Week or something along those lines, so my colleague went off new to the cluster with myself, and we arranged various activities that they've done previously, things like Zumba, and it's called Fit Steps, so it's like around dancing. That was fantastic, all planned. Booked it all in, and then we discovered they're fasting for Ramadan. It's like that has totally slipped our mind. And the difficulty is they won't come along because the ladies are so tired because they're not eating. And I think that's a valid point. You've got to be aware of the different things and the different festivals. But to know them all, I don't know if you'll ever, not make that mistake, if you know what I mean.
I think one of the ways that we and again, it's our experience as a community centre as much as the Communities First programme with this, is we've consciously developed a multicultural workforce. So you've got a massive advantage around language. In our office, there's 20 languages spoken with the staff group. We've got one, and that goes right the way through to play workers, admin workers. It's not to do with just the frontline Communities First staff. We've got a good example of that is one of the play workers we've got. She's Hungarian. She married a Sudanese guy. So she speaks Hungarian, Arabic and English. So you can't buy that,
No.
And it's there on tap.
And Helen from your team, Helen Edgeworth, when
Yeah.
she joined us for one of the previous podcasts, and was touching on some of the, clearly because it's it's part of her work as well in terms of community involvement within the a lot of the learning strand that she does, some of the ESOL training. That was very, very clear about that sensitivity and that acknowledgement of different groups and ethnicities.
So you bring volunteers into the mix as well, so and we do it in a very conscious way. We it's not random. We will spot gaps and we will develop it. We've been working more with people from a whole variety of Eastern European countries who have come into the city in the last 6-7 years. The first tranches of people that came in were Polish people, some of the people from the Czech Republic. Generally, they were temporary economic migrants. They weren't people sort of fleeing anything other than the particular arduousness that they were experiencing within their country and their ability to earn money. So they were using their European status in order to come here. We had very little problem with communicating with those. But the newer communities that have come in from Estonia, from Romania, from Bulgaria, Lithuania, there's a lot more difficulty with those. They're coming from more entrenched areas of poverty. They're coming from with much lower levels of educational attainment, and they're often fleeing a lot of prejudice to do with their Roma status as well. Our response to that was we identified a volunteer from the community that spoke numerous Eastern European languages. We developed him into a tutor status. We put him through a PETALS course. We linked him up to the WEA, and he now delivers English language, and we employ him to do extra bits of support work with Eastern Europeans. So it's about how you develop your workforce is the best way to respond with this, and that's workforce as a formal workforce and workforce as volunteers.
I think that's key for us. If I didn't have key volunteers in the community, I wouldn't make any. I wouldn't get into the community basically, and that's because as well it's a cultural thing. Obviously, work with the majority of the BME people I work with. I don't know the figure off the top of my head, but it's likely to be about 80% women. The reason being that we largely know is that a lot of the fathers and the dads work evenings. They work in the restaurants or they work in the taxis, and we have very little contact with them. And if I want to get involved in that community, if I didn't have key volunteers and people who we've met over the years, we would really struggle to get anything done.
The other thing,
sorry, Andrew, that's something that Helen made a point of saying. One of the things that she said in the last podcast was that she's taken the step to be, I think, the secretary of 2 of the Butetown football clubs, because that gives her more contact with men, and I think primarily Somali men was one of the ones that she sort of referred to, one of the groups, and that's a conscious decision on her part. And
they'll always know their community better than you, if you know what I mean.
It is part of that offer. And the other thing, the more you work with people from within communities, either within the volunteering capacity or if you bring them into the workforce, they become your ambassadors. You don't have to train them to be ambassadors. They naturally become it. And we've got a very, very open door policy within our organisation, quite literally an open door. The door's open, people walk in. And we do a lot of informal support, advice, making the odd phone call, this type of stuff. But I always work off the premise that every person you help in that sort of way might take 10 minutes, quarter an hour of your time, or any member of staff. But the gain from that is immense, because every person you help, there's 10 other people know about it. And 10 other people know that somebody helped them. And so they go, oh, all right. I got a lovely example of some work we did with a Polish guy. Again, in an ESOL class, did make the move to stay here. And he went through our ESOL process, got out the other end, got a level of English, went into work. He came back in about 3 years later. He came up to me and he went, "Remember me, Paolo?" And I said, "Yeah, I remember you." And he's going, "Here's my cousin." And he just literally handed over his cousin to us and said, "Now help him." So it's that type of way you work with people, that the gain you get from helping people is not only that they respect you, but they will actually work. I mean, he was working as an outreach officer for us in a totally natural way.
Are you able to articulate that when it comes to writing and drafting community involvement plans? Because clearly, just listening to you, there's a clarity behind that sort of instance and that sort of thing. And likewise yourself, Peter, in terms of working with volunteers and through volunteers, there's a clarity. You recognise the value of that and the merit of that. Is it easy and straightforward to articulate that in the plans?
Relatively, I mean, we go into quite a bit of detail. The other thing I will mention now is the depth of involvement as well, and it's the fact that as an organisation, we've developed with the changing demographics, and we've existed for 40 years. when our organisation first existed, the ethnic minority population of the Riverside area was about 5%. Now it's 50. And so we've grown with the changes of demographics, and we've reflected it in our management committee, we reflected it in our staff. And I was also, prior to us being involved with Communities First, I was a voluntary sector representative on the community of interest for ethnic minorities in Cardiff. So we build up these huge networks of people we work with, and I reflect that into my community involvement plans.
Okay. And if I was nostalgic for the mention of the vet, nostalgic for the mention of a community of interest in Communities First, but which long predates the sort of cluster configuration of the programme. There's a danger that sounds flippant as well, but I suppose to a certain extent when you're working with some of those ethnic groups, some of those community groups and those different demographics, some of the work that was being done then is the sort of stuff that is being built on now.
We built it in. In fact, when we launched the current cluster-based programme in Cardiff, we went through a process where the initial employment was ring-fenced to current Communities First employees, and we've inherited 2 or 3 of the actual employees. In fact, the manager from the ethnic minority programme now leads on our health programme. It's not just getting the people in the mix, it's the connections and the networks they bring with them as well.
And I think that's always an interesting perspective. So Peter, you talk about more recent influx from West Africa then, for instance, in your cluster. Yeah. And I think you can sometimes almost get bogged down on the day-to-day and the week-to-week work of what we're doing. But I suppose if we kind of take a step back, work that you're doing with that West African population now, for instance, will be built on in 10, 15, 20 years' time. Whatever iteration of this programme or successive programmes is doing or is called, there will be people able to go, well, when they first arrived or when we first had contact, they were first visible to us, we started doing this. So it's important not, I think sometimes I think of it just as the here and now, just doing stuff to people. It's actually going to be,
definitely.
Absolutely. And, as long as you're alert enough, what you pick up as well is the globalness of what you're about. Because inner city life, it's like inner city life anywhere in the world these days. Inner city life is a multicultural global issue. People are moving much easier across the planet, for good reasons and sometimes quite tragic reasons. So you've got people coming not only because they're coming because of the horrible type of situation they might have been caught in and need to get out of. You've also got huge amounts of people coming into the city that are coming just because they can. So you've got people from South America, from all over Europe. You've got French you've got French people working in the city.
And that's what I think the JRF work that Duncan's referring to has very much not discovered. I think it was known, but I think it's much more sort of clearly articulated that it's important when you're looking at somebody to consider what the migration journey has been. In a very literal sense, where have they come from, via which countries, but also what are the circumstances behind that migration. And it might be different motives to different bits of the journey. So it could be something prompting somebody to leave some difficult situations in their home country, settling somewhere, but then meeting somebody and deciding to move on for work, for family reasons, for whatever else. And I think it's about being alert to that rather than just defining everybody by their ethnicity.
And that's the thing as well. It's very... Sometimes communities can become quite transient. So what we find it comes in like swathes. So for example, at the minute we have got a big influx on our ESOL classes of young men from Eritrea. They flee Eritrea because of human rights issues and conscript in the army. They will arrive at Swansea, there'll be 20, 30 of them. We'll see them for a long period of time, for a couple of months, and then they're gone. And the difficulty that has is they're not forming communities as such, they're just sort of existing in the city. They're not becoming part of a specific community. So they'll get involved, but then the work you do with them, it could end tomorrow.
This is a terrific example of what, again, Duncan was saying. The more transient communities don't put roots down so much, whereas some people within ethnic minority groups, might be living in some statistical sense, poverty and in difficult situations, but actually because they are part of a community, that actually provides quite a bit to them in terms of quality of life.
Absolutely.
And that we shouldn't ignore that either.
No, it's a social aspect of, if people have friends and family they can rely on, that's an immense benefit. It very often is the counterbalance to some of the relative poverty they're living in. The fact that it doesn't grind them down quite as much because there's someone they can talk to, someone they can visit, someone they can go to for a meal. It's also
mediating effect.
Absolutely. Okay. I mean, another thing is we often pick up on quite hidden parts of the influx of people into the communities as well. I'll give the example of the Libyan community in Cardiff. There was going back a number of years now, Gaddafi times in Libya, at the point when there was a relaxation of the controls that were being put on them, particularly by American forces, and there was so they were kind of stuck in Libya for a good many years, and then that was relaxed, and there was a massive influx of Libyan men in particular coming into British universities, and a huge amount of them came into Cardiff, both into Cardiff University and Cardiff Met. And in the main, they were people who were already quite well educated, and they were coming here not to do graduate degrees, they were coming to do masters and doctorates, and they were often here for anything up to 5, 6, 7, even 8. I know one person was here for 9 years doing a postgraduate, graduate and doctorate program. Universities gave them a lot of support. They were paying students. They were sponsored by the Libyan government, so they gave them a lot of support to make sure they were integrated into the country. But they came with families, and there was no support coming from the universities for the families. And that's what we picked up on. We picked up on the Libyan women. A stark example of that I'll give you is we picked up on them at the tail end of 1 year, and it was through a number of them who were living in the area, and they started coming to one of our mother and toddler groups, and that was the first contact we made. And so we began to say, these are the things we do as well, because they needed English language classes, well educated, so they were picking up English very quickly, but they still needed the classes. And so we got only a small amount, 2 or 3 into classes at the end of 1 year, so like in June, July. Our classes start up again in September, and I'll always remember this. I was actually it was in my office, and I was they opened the door. It was a day that we'd had as a day when people came for assessment into English classes. I opened the front door, and there were 40 Libyan women standing there, and they'd just been told about it over the summer, and they were just standing there. We'd never seen them before. And they were totally invisible because they were coming as spouses on visas. They were kind of invisible to the system. They were invisible to the university, but we could see them, and we were contacting them, and we were supporting them. And it's vital because these women are here, like I said, anything 4, 5, 6, 8, 9 years. So all the time they're here, they're coming with children. They're having more children while they're here. They'll be going to schools. They'll be going to doctors. They'll be going to hospitals. So they need that type of support to understand the system. They need the English language support. And that's the real value of what we can do on the ground because of where we're placed. We pick up on these little nuances of immigration.
Are there any sort of final points you want to make?
It's just to be alert of the changes that happen on the ground.
Okay.
And you can't take your eye off it for a minute. It's through our networks.
Okay.
It's us as a staff complement. It's us as a well-networked organisation. So we're in constant communication with people. Not a day goes by when there's not a conversation that takes place about something that's happened, something that's changed. And you need to absorb that and be conscious of how you build it into your programme work.
Is that fair to say those are formal channels of communication?
Both.
But also informal?
Both.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's very formal.
That's very, very helpful. I'm very, very grateful for you to both, particularly Peter yourself, dealing with the Cardiff rush hour traffic. Safe trip back to Swansea. Not so far for you, Allan, of course, but safe trip to you as well. And I look forward to hearing from you again, maybe.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you for listening to the Community Development Podcast. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at comdevt podcast, COMMDEVT podcast. And to support the podcast and help it share learning, connect the workforce, and raise the profile and the merits of community development approaches, why not become a Patreon at patreon.com/the CD podcast.